The Sapphire Nexus Cantina, on Station Nexus 7, buzzed with the usual collection of traders, smugglers, and various species trying to forget their problems in fermented liquids. The air recyclers worked overtime against the mix of sulfur breath, methane burps, and something that smelled distinctly like rotting fish wrapped in old socks. At the center of it all stood Korvik Thane, a Zephyrian, whose purple skin gleamed under the bar's neon lights. His forearms gestured wildly as he regaled his audience with tales that grew more impressive with each telling. The guy had the subtlety of a plasma cannon and twice the noise output. "So there I was," Korvik announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who believed their own publicity, face to face with a Betelgeuse rock crawler, 8 feet of pure muscle and rage, claws like plasma cutters. He flexed his upper arms for dramatic effect, conveniently ignoring the fact that Betelgeuse rock crawlers were notoriously nearsighted and moved about as fast as continental drift. The crowd of mixed species nodded appreciatively. Most had never seen a rock crawler outside of Holovids, so Korvik's version sounded appropriately terrifying. A few Andromedan traders leaned in closer, their compound eyes reflecting the bar lights like disco balls. "Did you use your famous paralysis darts?" asked Moran, a regular who'd heard this story 17 times but enjoyed the free drinks that came with encouraging Korvik's ego. "Paralysis darts?" Korvik scoffed, his chest puffing out like an inflated balloon. "Real hunters don't need chemical assistance. I took that beast down with nothing but my bare hands and superior intellect." He conveniently omitted the part about the rock crawler being barely adolescent and half-starved when he'd found it. That's when Amy Kowalski walked in. She didn't make an entrance so much as she simply appeared, the way shadows shift when you're not paying attention. Human, obviously, though most of the Cantina's patrons had never seen one up close. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing clothes that suggested utility over fashion. She moved to a corner booth with the kind of quiet confidence that real predators possessed, ordered something called whiskey from the confused bartender and settled in to observe. Korvik's keen hunter instincts, which apparently worked better on potential audiences than actual prey, immediately locked onto her. A human, on his lucky day. Everyone knew humans came from some backwater death world called Earth, which made them exotic enough to impress. Plus, she was sitting alone, which in Korvik's experience meant she was probably lonely and desperate for attention from a famous hunter like himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice rising to ensure the newcomer heard every word. "Let me tell you about the time I tracked an Andromedan tree swinger through the acid forests of Kepler Prime." His stories suddenly became more elaborate, his gestures more dramatic. The tree swinger grew from 6 feet to 8 feet, its claws became razors, the acid rain became a torrential downpour that would melt lesser beings. Through it all, Amy sipped her drink and watched with the kind of attention a scientist might pay to an interesting, but not particularly bright specimen. "The beast was cunning," Korvik continued, now playing entirely to his human audience of one, using the canopy to mask its approach. "But you can't fool a nose like mine." He tapped his prominent nasal ridge with obvious pride. I could smell its fear sweat from 50 meters away. What he didn't mention was that Andromedan tree swingers were vegetarians with all the aggressive instinct of overripe fruit, and that the particular specimen in question had been recovering from a broken leg when he'd cornered it. The other patrons continued their appreciative murmurs, but Korvik's attention was entirely focused on the quiet human in the corner. She had to be impressed, right? Humans were supposed to be from a dangerous world, so surely she'd recognize and appreciate a kindred spirit, a fellow apex predator. Amy just took another sip of her whiskey, and continued watching him with those oddly calm eyes, like she was working out some complex equation in her head. Korvik was just getting to the part where he'd supposedly wrestled the tree swinger into submission using an ancient Zephyrian combat technique, when Amy's voice cut through his narrative like a blade through butter. "Excuse me," she said, her tone conversational and polite, the kind of polite that made smart beings nervous. "I couldn't help but overhear your fascinating stories. I have just one question though." Every head in the cantina turned toward her. Korvik preened, assuming she was about to ask for his autograph, or maybe request a private demonstration of his hunting prowess. "Of course, my dear," he replied, puffing out his chest even further. At this rate, he was going to need a bigger shirt. "Ask away. No question too complex for a hunter of my caliber." Amy tilted her head slightly, like a bird studying a particularly interesting insect. In all these hunts you've described, did any of them walk away? The question hung in the air like a bad smell. Korvik blinked his large, golden eyes, clearly processing what should have been a simple inquiry, but somehow felt like walking into a trap he couldn't see. Walk away, he repeated, his voice losing some of its confident boom. What do you mean? Walk away. They were defeated, captured, brought to justice. His forearms made vague gestures that seemed less dramatic and more confused now. Right, captured. Amy nodded thoughtfully, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. So they lived through the encounter. That's interesting. Moran and Morton, two regular Cantina patrons who'd been enjoying the show, suddenly found themselves paying much closer attention. There was something in the human's tone that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere uncomfortable. Of course they lived, Korvik snapped, though he wasn't entirely sure why that should sound defensive. I'm a professional hunter, not some common murderer. I capture my prey for scientific study and legitimate business purposes. Ah, Amy said, and somehow managed to pack a universe of meaning into that single syllable. Scientific study. That's very responsible of you. She took another sip. And these creatures you've captured, where exactly do you conduct this scientific study? Korvik's purple skin began taking on a slightly greenish tinge, which in Zephyrian physiology indicated the early stages of panic. That's proprietary information, trade secrets, you understand. Oh. The human nodded again, that same thoughtful expression never leaving her face. Of course, I'm just curious because, well, where I come from, we have a saying, it's not the size of the predator in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the predator. She paused, letting that sink in, and another one. The most dangerous predator is the one you never see coming. Humans have a lot of sayings about predators, observed Morton, his antenna twitching nervously. We do, Amy agreed pleasantly. Occupational hazard, you might say. When your entire species evolved dodging things with bigger teeth, you tend to develop a certain perspective on hunting. Korvik was beginning to realize that this conversation had somehow gotten away from him. Wait, what do you mean dodging things with bigger teeth? Humans are from a death world. Sure, but, oh yes, Amy said, her smile never wavering but somehow becoming less warm. Earth, lovely place. Terrible weather though. Ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, that sort of thing. Really keeps you on your toes, evolutionarily speaking. The cantina had gone remarkably quiet. Even the background hum of conversation had died down as other patrons strained to listen. The thing about Deathworlders, Amy continued, still in that same conversational tone, is that we tend to fall into two categories. There are the ones that got big and scary to survive. She gestured vaguely in Korvik's direction. And then there are the ones that got smart and persistent. Korvik's golden eyes narrowed. What exactly are you implying? Oh, nothing at all, Amy said, finishing her whiskey and setting the glass down with a soft clink. I'm just making conversation. Though I am curious about one thing. What? Amy's calm gaze met his increasingly agitated stare. When you were hunting all these dangerous creatures, did you ever wonder what might be hunting you? The question hit Korvik like a plasma blast to the solar plexus. His forearms twitched involuntarily, and suddenly he was remembering things he'd rather forget. Things that didn't match the heroic narratives he'd been spinning for years. Like that Betelgeusian rock crawler he'd been bragging about. The truth was significantly less impressive than his barroom version. 3 months ago, on the mining station Kepler 7, Korvik had tracked his quarry to an abandoned ore processing facility. But the 8 feet of pure muscle and rage had actually been a juvenile, barely 4 feet tall with a broken carapace that oozed greenish fluid. The poor creature had been injured in a tunnel collapse and was half-starved, moving with all the threatening menace of a sick puppy. Korvik had found it huddled in a corner, making soft whimpering sounds. It hadn't even tried to fight when he'd approached with his capture net. Those claws like plasma cutters were cracked and dull, and the creature had been too weak to do much more than weakly paw at the restraints. The rock crawler, Amy said quietly, as if she'd been reading his thoughts. Tell me, was it in good health when you found it? Korvik's throat felt suddenly dry. What do you mean? Simple question. Was your dangerous prey at full strength? fighting fit, or, she let the sentence hang like a noose. The Cantina's patrons were watching this exchange with the fascination of spectators at a particularly brutal sporting event. Moran leaned forward, his drink forgotten. Well, Korvik stammered, hunting is about opportunity. You understand. A smart predator doesn't take unnecessary risks. Ah, Amy nodded. So you hunt the sick, the young and the injured. That's very practical of you. And suddenly Morton was looking at Korvik with a different expression entirely. The Andromedan's compound eyes reflected a dawning understanding. Wait a minute, he said slowly. My cousin works security on Kepler 7. There was no epic battle with a rock crawler. There was a report about someone stealing an injured juvenile from a rescue shelter. Korvik's purple skin had now gone fully green. That's completely different. I was conducting legitimate research. Research, Amy repeated. The same way someone might say pile of rotting garbage. What kind of research requires capturing weakened specimens? The truth was crawling out of its hole like something slimy emerging from under a rock. Korvik's hunting business was actually a supply operation for the underground fighting rings that operated in the sector's darker corners. Injured, juvenile, or sick creatures were perfect for the rigged matches that separated gamblers from their credits. A healthy adult Betelgeuse-in rock crawler would have crushed any opponent put against it, which made for boring gambling. But a weakened juvenile? That could be made to lose at just the right moment, after putting on enough of a show to make the betting interesting. The tree swinger, Amy continued, her voice still maddeningly calm. Let me guess. Also young, maybe recovering from an injury. Korvik's memory supplied the unwelcome details. The Andromedan tree swinger had been found in a veterinary clinic, recovering from a broken leg and sedated for surgery. Korvik had simply walked in during a shift change, claimed to be a transfer specialist, and walked out with the unconscious creature. The epic hunt through acid forests had actually been a 5-minute drive through perfectly normal rain. The fighting rings, said a new voice from across the cantina. Commander Tom Molly, a station security officer who had been quietly nursing a drink in the corner, stood up slowly. I've been tracking suppliers for the Nexus 7 underground matches for months. Oh, this was getting better and better. Korvik felt like he was watching his entire carefully constructed reputation collapse in real time. You see, Amy explained to the increasingly hostile crowd, real predators don't need to brag about their kills. They don't need to exaggerate their prey, or make up elaborate stories. They just do what needs doing. Moran was looking at Korvik like he'd just realized he'd been buying drinks for a fraud. So all those stories, the epic battles, the superior hunting skills, complete fertilizer, finished Morden, his antenna practically vibrating with indignation. You've been taking advantage of injured animals, and selling them to illegal fight promoters. The crowd's mood had shifted from admiring to disgusted faster than Korvik could process. These beings had spent months listening to his tales, buying him drinks, treating him like some kind of celebrity. Now they were looking at him like something they'd scrape off their boots. Now wait just a minute, Korvik protested, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. You don't understand the complexities of my business model. Amy finished the last drops of her whiskey, and smiled that unsettling smile again. Oh, I understand perfectly. You're not a hunter, Korvik Thane. You're a scavenger with delusions of grandeur, and a very creative relationship with the truth. You know, Amy said, settling back in her chair like someone preparing to tell a bedtime story. Since we're sharing hunting tales, maybe I should contribute one of my own. She signaled the bartender for another whiskey. I've got some experience in the field myself. Korvik, desperate to regain some control of the situation, seized on this opening. Oh really? And what kind of dangerous prey have you hunted, little human? The condescending tone was a mistake. Amy's smile didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, like storm clouds gathering on a horizon. Well, let's see. During the Titan Wars I spent 18 months tracking corporate raiders through the methane storms of Saturn's moons. She accepted her fresh drink from the nervous bartender, who was clearly wondering if he should call station security. Nasty business, that. The storms last for weeks, temperatures drop to -200 Celsius, and the atmospheric pressure could crush most species flat. But the raiders had been hitting civilian mining operations, so someone had to go after them. Commander Molly raised an eyebrow. The Titan Wars had been legendary for their brutality, fought in some of the most hostile conditions known to galactic civilization. The tricky part, Amy continued conversationally, wasn't the environment. Humans are pretty adaptable that way. No, the challenge was that these raiders were using military-grade equipment and had a 3-week head start. Korvik was beginning to realize that Amy's stories had a disturbing lack of obvious exaggeration. No dramatic gestures, no inflated descriptions, just matter-of-fact recounting that somehow made everything sound more terrifying. "So how did you catch them?" asked Morden, genuinely curious, despite his earlier disgust with Korvik. "Oh, the usual human approach," Amy replied with a shrug. "We followed their supply chain. See, most species would have tried to track them directly through the storms, but humans learned a long time ago that persistence beats speed. We figured out where they were getting their food, their fuel, their spare parts. Then we just waited." She took a sip of whiskey and continued. "Took 6 months, but eventually they had to come to us. Funny thing about raiders, they're usually not very good at long-term planning. They'd gotten used to quick strikes and fast escapes. They weren't prepared for someone willing to sit in a frozen wasteland for half a year just to catch them." The cantina had gone completely silent. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. 6 months, Morin repeated weakly. "In those conditions." "Oh, that was nothing compared to the asteroid belt conflicts," Amy said cheerfully. "Ever tried to catch smugglers in zero gravity? No atmosphere, no gravity, radiation levels that would cook most species in hours. The smugglers thought they were safe because nobody else was crazy enough to operate in that environment long term." Korvik was starting to sweat, which was impressive considering Zephyrians had no sweat glands. "How long were you out there?" 2 years, Amy replied casually, living in sealed suits, breathing recycled air, eating protein paste. The smugglers had all this fancy equipment, stealth ships, jamming devices, the works, but they made one crucial mistake. "What mistake?" Commander Molly asked, though he had the look of someone who already suspected the answer. "They assumed their environment was their protection. But see, humans evolved on a planet that spent most of its time trying to kill us. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, climate shifts that wiped out 90% of all life every few million years. We got very good at adapting to things that shouldn't be survivable." Amy's tone remained conversational, but there was something underneath it now, something that made intelligent beings want to check the exits. The smugglers had better ships, better weapons, better equipment, but they couldn't handle the isolation, the constant danger, the grinding stress of never knowing if today was the day their life support failed. After 6 months, they started making mistakes. After a year they were sloppy. After 18 months, they were practically begging to be caught just so they could go somewhere with breathable atmosphere and real food. She finished her second whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate precision. "That's the thing about humans, you see. We're not the biggest or the strongest or the fastest, but we're very, very hard to get rid of, and we have this irritating habit of never giving up." Korvik's 4 hands were now trembling visibly. You're military," was Amy corrected. "These days I work freelance, tracking down beings who think they're clever, beings who prey on the weak and injured, beings who think they understand what real predators look like." The implications of that statement hit Korvik like a freight shuttle. This wasn't a chance encounter. This wasn't a random human who'd wandered into his favorite bragging spot. "You've been hunting me," he whispered. Amy's smile was absolutely terrifying in its friendliness. Hunting is such an aggressive word. "I prefer researching, though I have to admit, your reputation made you remarkably easy to find. Most actual predators try to avoid drawing attention to themselves." She stood up slowly, and somehow that simple action made every being in the cantina tense up. "The funny thing about humans, Korvik, is that we're persistence hunters. We don't need to be faster than our prey. We don't need to be stronger. We just need to be more stubborn." Korvik was now backing away from her, though there wasn't really anywhere to go in the crowded cantina. "What do you want?" "Justice," Amy replied simply. "And maybe some answers about where you've been selling those injured creatures." See, some of them belong to species protected under Galactic conservation accords. That makes their illegal capture and sale a very serious crime. The human took a step forward, and Korvik took 2 steps back, bumping into a table full of Andromedan traders who were now looking at him with undisguised hatred. The really interesting part, Amy continued, is that I've been tracking your supply network for 8 months now. Very thorough investigation. Every creature you've captured, every illegal fight you've supplied, every credit you've earned from the suffering of helpless beings. Korvik's purple skin had gone completely white. He was beginning to understand exactly what kind of predator he was dealing with, and more importantly, he was beginning to understand that he had been the prey all along. The cantina's atmosphere had shifted from entertaining evening to public execution, and Korvik was rapidly becoming the guest of honor at his own downfall. The beings who'd been buying him drinks and hanging on his every word were now looking at him like he was something unpleasant they'd accidentally stepped in. "You sick freak," Moran spat, rising from his seat. "I've been buying drinks for a creature trafficker this whole time. My species considers what you've done to be among the worst crimes possible," added Morden, his antenna quivering with disgust. "Preying on the injured and helpless. That's not hunting. That's vulturism." The crowd was closing in, and Korvik's 4 eyes darted frantically around the cantina, looking for an escape route. Unfortunately for him, Amy seemed to have positioned herself between him and the only exit, which was either remarkable luck or exceptional planning. Given what he'd learned about humans in the last few minutes, he was betting on planning. That's when the cantina doors hissed open, and Judge Quintera walked in. The Altarian magistrate's crystalline features reflected the bar's neon lights in prismatic patterns, but her expression was anything but colorful. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone carrying official business and bad news in equal measure. "Judge Quintera," Commander Molly called out, straightening to attention. "Perfect timing, Commander Molly," the judge acknowledged before turning her multifaceted gaze to Korvik. "Korvik Thane, I presume I have several warrants for your arrest. Illegal trafficking of protected species, operation of unlicensed fighting rings, fraud and conspiracy to commit animal cruelty across 4 systems." Korvik's face went through several more color changes, settling on a sickly yellow that suggested his internal organs were reconsidering their career choices. "This is ridiculous. I'm a legitimate businessman. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Amy said helpfully, "though based on your performance tonight, that might be a new experience for you." The judge pulled out an official-looking datapad that hummed with legal authority. "Korvik Thane, you're also facing charges of impersonating a licensed hunter, falsifying hunting permits, and tax evasion on illegal gambling proceeds." "Tax evasion?" Morden asked, impressed despite himself. "Always gets them in the end," Amy observed. "Criminals never learn to keep proper books." Korvik's panic was reaching critical levels. His 4 arms flailed wildly as his tiny brain finally computed that bragging about his crimes to a cantina full of witnesses might not have been his smartest career move. In a desperate burst of what he probably thought was cunning, he lunged toward Amy, apparently deciding that taking a hostage was his best option. It was like watching someone try to wrestle a shadow. Amy sidestepped his clumsy charge with minimal effort, causing Korvik to crash face first into the table she'd been sitting at. As he bounced off the furniture, she casually stuck out 1 foot, sending him sprawling across the cantina floor in a tangle of purple limbs and wounded dignity. "Ow," Korvik groaned from somewhere under an overturned chair. "Oh, sorry about that," Amy said, not sounding sorry at all. "Reflexes. You know how it is with us Deathworlders." Korvik struggled to his feet, now sporting an impressive bruise across his nasal ridge and a look of desperate fury.
"You think you're so clever, human.
"But I've been hunting dangerous creatures across the galaxy. I know how to fight." What followed could generously be called a fight the same way a hurricane could be called a light breeze. Korvik charged again, this time with all 4 arms windmilling, in what might have been some sort of combat technique if observed from a great distance with poor lighting. Amy caught his first arm, redirected his momentum, and used his own charge to send him spinning into the bar with a crash that rattled bottles. As he bounced off the counter, she was already there to helpfully guide his trajectory toward the nearest wall, where he met the surface with a sound like a wet fish hitting pavement. The key, Amy explained to the fascinated audience, as Korvik slid down the wall, is to let physics do most of the work. Conservation of momentum is a universal constant, after all. Korvik tried one last desperate gambit, pulling what looked like a small energy pistol from his jacket. The weapon had barely cleared his holster before Amy's hand shot out, faster than most beings could follow, and suddenly Korvik was holding empty air, while Amy examined the pistol with professional interest. Cheap Regellian knockoff, she observed, ejecting the power cell with practiced ease. Probably would have exploded in your hand after 3 shots. Really, Korvik, if you're going to threaten someone, invest in quality equipment. She tossed the disabled weapon back to him, where it bounced harmlessly off his chest. Judge Quintera, Amy said, turning to the magistrate with perfect composure. I believe your prisoner is ready for transport. Oh, and you'll want to check his left boot. He's got a list of his buyers hidden in a false sole. Korvik's expression of defeated amazement would have been comical if he hadn't spent years profiting from the suffering of helpless creatures. When did you? 8 months of investigation, Amy replied. Amazing what you can learn when you actually do your homework. 10 minutes later, Korvik Thane was secured in Judge Quintera's custody restraints, his reputation as scattered as the furniture he'd bounced off during his brief, unsuccessful combat career. The once mighty hunter now looked like exactly what he was, a small-time criminal who'd gotten too comfortable with his own lies. The thing about real predators, Amy said, addressing the cantina's patrons as Commander Molly led Korvik toward the exit, is that they don't need to announce themselves. They just do their job and move on. She gathered her jacket and prepared to leave, but Moran called out, Wait, what's your real name? Your real job? Amy paused at the door and smiled that dangerous smile one last time. Amy Kowalski, licensed bounty hunter, Galactic Conservation Enforcement Division, and before you ask, yes, we always get our target. Always, asked Morden, his compound eyes wide with newfound respect. Humans invented the phrase you can run, but you can't hide, Amy replied. We meant it quite literally. As the cantina doors closed behind her, the remaining patrons sat in stunned silence for several long moments. Finally, Moran raised his glass in a shaky toast. To Deathworlders, he said quietly. The real ones. To humans, Morden added with feeling. Remind me never to get on their bad side. The bartender, who'd been silent through the entire evening's entertainment, finally spoke up. You know what the really scary part is? Everyone turned to look at him. She knew exactly where he'd hidden that buyer list, which means she's probably been in his quarters, gone through his files, maybe even followed him for months. The bartender's 6 arms trembled slightly as he cleaned a glass, and he never knew she was there. The implications of that settled over the cantina like a cold wind. Somewhere out there in the galaxy, other criminals were going about their business, confident in their cleverness, completely unaware that patient, persistent humans might already be watching, waiting, and gathering evidence. Judge Quintera's voice drifted back through the closing doors. Korvik Thane, you're charged with 47 counts of. The list went on for quite some time. Outside in the station corridor, Amy Kowalski walked away into the crowd, just another unremarkable human among the thousands of beings going about their daily lives. But now the cantina's patrons knew something they hadn't known before. The most dangerous hunters were the ones you never saw coming, and humans, it turned out, were very good at not being seen.